right? Like when the Department of Education investigated school districts for the disciplinary disparities, they instructed their investigators to look into things even as simple as a loss of recess privileges for possible bias in teacher decision making. So you're seeing a system where all quote-unquote exclusionary discipline now comes with reams of paperwork.
Welcome to the Safety Doc Podcast with author, radio host, and nationally recognized safety expert, Dr. David Perrodin. Join us each week as we discuss the best and most bizarre practices in safety preparation and crisis response. Follow Dr. Perrodin on Twitter at SafetyPhD. And remember, the truth will keep you safe.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. David Perrodin, and welcome to the Safety Doc Podcast. With me today, Max Eden. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Before joining the Manhattan Institute, he was a program manager of the Education Policy Studies Department at the American Enterprise Institute. His research interests include early education, school choice, and federal education policy. He was co-editor with Frederick M. Hess of the Every Student Succeeds Act, what it means for schools, systems, and states. Max's work has appeared in scholarly and popular outlets such as the Journal of School Choice, Encyclopedia of Education, Economics, and Finance, Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report, National Review, Claremont Review of Books, and the Weekly Standard. Max co-authored the book, the best-selling book, Why Meadow Died, the people and policies that created the Parkland shooter and endanger America's students. Max, thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, who's in charge of school safety with your research, everything you've done? Who's in charge? Who's calling the shots?
I suppose the answer could either be nobody or unfortunately very distant bureaucrats and advocacy activist organizations whose primary emphasis is on trying to change the numbers to make them look better, with the idea that justice and safety will follow. I think in the past, we've tended to think about school discipline, school safety as something that the principal was in charge of and maybe the superintendent oversees. And you kind of trust that the principal is acting primarily with an eye towards the students in front of him, the teachers in front of him. What do I need to do to keep this kid safe, to keep these students safe, to keep things in order? And you kind of trusted that was where they were looking when making these decisions. Unfortunately, in the past 10 years, just about, we've seen an increasing emphasis kind of from reformers to try to close the so-called school-to-prison pipeline by aggressively lowering suspensions, expulsions, and arrests on the grounds that the disparities there were racially biased and biased by disability. So now principals are operating under a pressure that they're getting from superintendents who are operating in a pressure they get from state education authorities or from groups like the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center with threats of litigation and bad press, or the Department of Education, to try to get these numbers down. So the principal is now looking with one eye towards the students and teachers around him, and with the other eye looking back over his shoulder, and isn't making concrete, practical decisions solely based on what's good for the kids, but is making it based on what's good for the numbers.
Max, something I have seen in job postings for educators, for principals, that I didn't see a year or two ago. A very specific statement, must have experience in social justice, must be sensitive to social justice needs of the district and the community. Now, what I'm not seeing is must be able to identify a reading baseline for all students, must be able to articulate how to measure a change from baseline. All things that are fundamental to education, But these very specific statements, which definitely show the hand of what's happening, what you're saying, it's about lowering the numbers for suspensions, expulsions. I'm in Wisconsin, and the numbers for suspensions have continued to decrease. The gap between academic achievement of African American students and white students continues to grow.
So perhaps not unrelated developments.
Right. So this correlation or causation it isn't necessarily proving out with efficacy in the statistics in my state. So tell me, discipline policies. What gets reported? What are districts more or less saying? If I report this, the state's going to be looking at it. The Fed's going to look at it. What do they have to really think about before they're going to make that decision to report?
Before answering that, I want to jump off from an earlier point to kind of get there, right? I mean, when you see education job postings, administrative job postings, district bureaucrat job postings have this new emphasis on social justice, racial equity, kind of buzzwords about social justice, and not about things like reading comprehension, baseline levels, Lexile levels. You're seeing kind of at the school level a shift that's occurred in the reform and advocacy community kind of filtered down, right? For several decades, the logic behind education reform was we see these gaps, we recognize that these gaps reflect broader inequities in society, and our job is to try to figure out how we can push and prod and help schools do their bread and butter better to try to make these gaps smaller. The gaps didn't close as much as they would have liked them to have closed, and at a certain point, I think a lot of education policy advocates kind of changed their prescription. They became less convinced that these were problems outside society, more convinced that because they hadn't closed the gaps fast enough, the real problem must be within schools. They must be not something that students bring with them to the classroom, but something that happens to students in the classroom. So when we see the discipline gap, the reading gap, the impetus now is to assume that there's something going on that's wrong in the school and to try to change attitudes of educators, assuming that that's where the crux of the problem lies. Because what you will hear quite frequently from advocates of discipline reform is that there is no difference in student behavior by racial groups, by disability status. The entire disparity is a product of teacher bias or school practices. So it's incumbent on us to change those as quickly as possible because we see these numbers and these numbers show injustice. We need to address this injustice. Once you have that, you have a very numbers-driven approach to assuming progress, right? You assume that if you can lower these apparent gaps, which shouldn't exist in the first place, it's a win-win. You are reducing bias, reducing unfair and prejudiced decisions, while creating a greater sense of justice, and safety won't be sacrificed as part of it because these were not proper decisions in the first place. So, when you're a teacher, at the top line, certainly expulsions need to be done with great care. Suspensions are something that you hear from your principal quite frequently that we don't want you to do. We need you to do a whole lot of paperwork before you send a student to our office, and the reason we're making you do all this paperwork is fundamentally an extension of that logic. Like, we don't trust that your judgment or your instinct will be prudent, will be proper, so before we let you send this kid to our office, check all of these boxes first. And then once the student's sent to the principal's office, the principal is told by the district administrator, either explicitly or implicitly, frequently quite explicitly, we need to make sure that these numbers are low and getting lower, and we're judging the success of the principals that we see by the way that these numbers change. In some cases, it can go down even to the level of detentions and loss of recess privileges, right? Like when the Department of Education investigated school districts for the disciplinary disparities, they instructed their investigators to look into things even as simple as a loss of recess privileges for possible bias in teacher decision making. So you're seeing a system where all quote unquote exclusionary discipline now comes with reams of paperwork attached to it, and that paperwork has a prejudice behind it that what the teacher wants to do or his or her first instinct is probably not right.
Max, also with state reporting, I was examining North Carolina's state reporting for school discipline instance. Literally over 100 areas that could be identified from a fray, right? So the definition of a fray is an instance of fighting in a public place that disturbs the peace. So you have many areas which are similar to other areas. So the question comes up, why do we have 100 areas we can report on, from gambling to a fray to bullying to harassment, and then fracture it down? And I believe one of the reasons that happens right now is even if you have a certain number of events, if you're spreading them over 10 categories, that's a lot different than spreading them over 100 categories. You maybe have some hills that get reported, but you don't have some mountains. And when I work with superintendents and school administrators and say, look at the data has gotten to be a mile wide and an inch deep. It doesn't mean anything to them. And as you indicated, the discretion factor has completely has been siphoned from the classroom. It used to be the teacher was in charge of classroom rules. Well, we know that's really not the case anymore. My dad was a principal for 35 plus years. I was a school administrator. Things have changed. As you indicated, all of these filter systems are in place right now. And the message it's sending is that we don't trust the discretion of the educator. I believe it's sending that message. And so I want to get into a trend that I've been seeing to have you bring perspective to it. But for suspensions, so what are you seeing right now in suspension data versus 5 years, 10 years ago? Where is it trending? And at some point, is it going to just hit a bottom? Is it going to bottom out? And the numbers can only get so good. And actually, Max, I look at a lot of the numbers, and the numbers are looking great. I mean, some districts I'll look at, and we've dropped from 38 suspensions last year down to 1. And then the question is, is the school safer? Is the climate better? Are kids, is attendance up? Is truancy changed? Any of that? Well, they don't go there.
It's in some ways almost reached the level of comic dishonesty. Kind of my first foray into this was a report that I wrote looking at New York City school climate surveys as suspensions were plummeting, right? So suspensions plummeted under de Blasio's discipline reform, which basically said to teachers, you can only seek a suspension after the third instance of a certain level of behavior. And then the principal has to send in an application to the superintendent's office, which the superintendent's office can reject, right? So these things go down, or that suspensions go down. Student reports of climate problems increase. In one school, I did a kind of in-depth journalistic foray into the Urban Assembly School of Wildlife Conservation, where a student was stabbed and killed by a classmate. And this was a case where the school fell into absolute chaos when a new assistant principal came in, and they were told, we expect that you'll have very few suspensions. And they did, by not enforcing rules. And the school fell into, it became a place of consistent daily violence. And the killing of this student was hardly a mistake. Shortly after that happened, there was a spike in suspensions district-wide. And when the chancellor of the New York City schools addressed this spike, he said something very close to, well, yes, now we're seeing a whole bunch of schools, report more.
Thank you for tuning in to the Safety Doc Podcast with the nation's leading safety expert, Dr. David Perrodin, author, radio show host, university instructor, researcher, expert witness, and consultant. Powerful testimonials. Dr. Perrodin has a strong reputation as the go-to safety consultant, and he was still able to exceed our expectations. When we went looking for an expert in the field of crisis preparedness and prevention, David was the single person we pursued. Not easy stepping into the touchier subjects of life, but Dr. David pulls it off. Take a listen. Now, back to Dr. David Perrodin and the Safety Doc Podcast.
Basically acknowledging that a lot of the decrease had been a product of serial underreporting. Yes. And then, of course, ever since then, the numbers go lower and lower. In Washington, D.C., suspensions fell really dramatically by about 40% in 2 years. They found out that in many schools, the way they were getting suspensions down was by not telling the district office that they were suspending students, and then just emailing teachers to say, don't let these students into the school. So I think the numbers have reached a point where they're already nonsense. I shouldn't say which district, but I spoke to a teachers union official in one North Carolina district who intimated to me that the system that the district uses to track suspensions is actually entirely disconnected from the state system, and that district administrators selectively migrate over certain things from one system to another in order to make it look consistently lower, even as it's maintaining, in that case, a pretty stable level in reality.
Manipulated statistics, manipulated data. I've also seen it. I have seen districts report zero out for suspensions, and after having numerous previous years of whatever, 75, 100, and now it goes to zero. And the question when I investigated was, is this authentically zero, or did someone make a data entry mistake? Did someone not fill this out? Because that happens sometimes. So, but no, it was authentic, but there were other things that were substituting out for suspension. Now, the part that was troubling to me was that the state that this was in did not have any type of filter system. There wasn't a call back to the district saying, you reported your state data for suspensions and you have a zero, and last year you had 112. Is that a mistake? That's zero? Right. And if not, can we send everybody to your district to see the miracle that's happening? And there's this perception that there's a state accountability. There are data analysts who are going through this and are picking this out. Or at the very least, there is some algorithm, something in a program which triggers this and sends an email to someone saying, hey, this number doesn't seem right. Give a call to the district. That doesn't exist. No. That doesn't exist at all. And that was
which is the dirty, funny little secret about all of these numbers, right? Like nobody looks at them anyway, really.
Right. Right.
The idea is to get these numbers lower on the theory that that's the way that you demonstrate your success to a higher up, which is true to a point maybe within a school district, whether that's true or not. But when it gets reported up to the state, there's nobody from the state that's going to come knocking. In Miami, as soon as they banned suspensions, they saw thousands of fights stop happening. There were thousands fewer fights from one year to the next. And there is, taking aside the question of the prudence and the wisdom of banning suspensions for nonviolent offenses, those fights didn't stop. But nobody from the state knocked on the door. Eventually, NPR wrote an article about it. That article did nothing in practice, but nobody's looking at these numbers.
Yeah, and I'm finding the same. I'm finding the same thing. I'm doing data work with superintendents, with school leaders, and we uncover some things that on face value are shocking. And again, the question, has anybody contacted you about this? Or they'll even discover an error. And it could be related also to the number of students with disabilities, and they wonder why their flow-through funding for the district went down and nobody got back to them. So we know that we don't have this oversight mechanism. And also there isn't much incentive to do that, because if the numbers are going in the right way, you don't want to
you don't want to rock
the waters,
boat,
right?
Yeah.
You don't want to do that at a state level, because you're going to draw scrutiny from the feds. I heard it many times as a school administrator, having the state officials speak to us at conferences and say, the feds are coming down on us. We need everybody to be very careful on discipline and very careful on serving students in placements outside of the district, for example, things like that. So, Max, I'm familiar with a process because I used it when I was an administrator. I know that it is being used right now. It's called an abeyance agreement. And an abeyance agreement is basically a suspended discipline measure. So it's either a suspended detention, a suspended suspension, a suspended expulsion. We hear these things badged as pre-expulsions. They're these little nifty agreements that districts put together with their legal counsel. And the part of this that is absolutely horrifying is you don't have to report any of this data out to anybody. It doesn't go to a local database, doesn't go to state, doesn't go to federal, so it doesn't exist on a database. But these are being driven by the attorneys for the school. Okay, they're driven by the attorneys. And I remember my first abeyance agreement. I didn't even know this existed, right? They don't teach you this.
No, and it doesn't really come up in the policy agreement. A lot of what you're saying is newer to me than I would prefer, honestly. It
doesn't. So all of a sudden, the attorney is there. This is a practice, and the attorney sits down and says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put this paperwork together, and we're going to tell the parent they have the choice to accept this abeyance agreement. And we're looking out in the best interest of their son or daughter. We're going to keep this off the record. Okay. Now that's just fancy way for the district saying, we don't want to report this data anyway. We need to do something. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to give this image. And abeyance agreements, they're effective in the fact that parents go along with them. If my child has done something which otherwise would have warranted a suspension 15 years ago, and in today it would warrant an abeyance agreement, the the legal counsel is typically present in the room. The parent, the student, the principal, and the legal counsel will say, the district could do this. They could suspend your child. They could go to expulsion, but we have something else, and this will also stay off your son or daughter's record. It's called this abeyance agreement. So the principal really wants your child to not have this on their record, and all of that. So if I'm the parent, I'm thinking, I didn't analyze this for a while until I started to talk to parents. I said, why would you take this? Because you're giving up your rights, and just what motivates you? And parents are like, well, the big positionality, right? A district, it's $1 million building, people with big salaries, degrees, diplomas on the wall. I'm intimidated by it. So I go along with it. They're sending me this deal. And if not, if the parent is coming in and thinking, I'm getting this deal because I'm going to go to the school board, I'm going to raise ruckus, and they're giving me this deal. Like I've earned this deal for my son or daughter.
Right.
So either way it happens. But these things are all over the place. They're ubiquitous. And there's no paper trail, no accountability. It's not a replacement of a suspension. There's no learning objective for how the behavior, a replacement behavior will be instituted, safety of the student body, nothing. So it frustrates me to no end because as I teach administrators, this is now just an accepted practice with them. Like it is just part of their job. And I'm like, it's you don't understand. This is wrong. Many levels, but they've just come into it. They've new superintendents, new principals. This is This is the landscape.
Yeah. No, that's it's very interesting, and it's a logical extension of what I had seen as a troubling trend, but I had a hard time putting my finger on exactly why it would, I couldn't project it all the way to the end, which one thing that the Obama administration did in its disciplinary initiative, its Dear Colleague letter, its investigation of school districts, was to basically train parents to come in and counter the disciplinary decisions made by school administrators, and to encourage school districts and encourage states to adopt stronger kind of appeals processes, right? So previously, which in a way it inverts the moral order that one thinks of when one thinks of a school, right? When one thinks of a school as an extension of the community, and a place that you trust to instill morals and mores and norms into kids. And you send your kid there, and if your kid gets in trouble, you probably back the school in
Right.
this thing, because you trust the teacher, the principal knew what they were doing. This new shift towards trying to respect the due process rights of a student, as though getting a 1 or 2 day suspension were somehow analogous to getting a 5 or 10 year prison sentence.
Yes.
Changed the valence of that, right? It sets up an oppositional dynamic between the parents and the schools, where parents are expected, incentivized to come in and countermand the decision of a school district, to say, no, my kid did not do this, or he did this, but you shouldn't do this to him. And there's a kind of a moral inversion there that I had been very troubled by, because I would like schools to be places where we trust the teachers make the right decisions, and we don't, parents back them rather than question them. But what you're saying makes a lot of sense, because that's not a really tenable long-term situation for a school district to basically assume that any decision that they make, they will face a possibility of a major problem, major hassle, major administrative problem, maybe even a legal problem, or pseudo-legal problem with that. So they in turn, by what you're saying, are like countering that entire process by not even having what's recognizably, laws or rules anymore, but kind of lifting the way that rule of law totally works and just, rewriting the laws for the kids as they go. And then that, maybe I'm getting a little bit high in the air here, but that it really inverts kind of just the logic of how rules and laws are supposed to work. It's something that should be set with expected consequences, fair enforcement. But now, from what you're saying, it's something that school districts kind of get ahead of to invent as they go. Records matter. Like having a record is not an intrinsically bad thing. Having a record is how a teacher knows who the student is who's coming into his or her classroom in the next year. And so when you have a student who either through abeyance agreements or through kind of IEP manipulation doesn't accrue a substantial disciplinary record, then the next teacher to get him or her doesn't know who that student is. And you're actually doing that student a huge disservice by not informing the teacher of his circumstances, and possibly doing him a disservice by not letting him have a record that could be used to get him or her additional supports,
Yes.
alternative placement if that's possible. So, a record is data, and by trying to keep kids from having a record, you're effectively destroying student data that should exist for a reason. We're seeing across a lot of states, and now a new push by the federal government to try to limit restraint and seclusion. And this is in many cases driven by some high-profile viral social media things. You see a video of a kid who's got his hands locked in arms locked in handcuffs behind his back, or you hear of some really egregious overreaction, and the policymakers like, right. Oh my God, like we can't have this stuff happening in our schools. Let's really clamp down on it. And a few high-profile instances of bad judgment get used to basically get translated into a broad signal that's sent down to teachers, which is that if you're going to lay a hand on a student, you're going to have to fill out a whole room of paperwork. You're going to have to put yourself in a position of professional risk, if you're even allowed to at all. And so the only circumstances in which you might be allowed to put a hand on a student is imminent physical danger of yourself or other students, and even then maybe not, because how do you define imminent physical danger?
Yes.
And so this is, we don't really have any data on this, right? Partly there's a data problem around restraint and seclusion, as we kind of spoke about a little bit before. Like, frequently it's not reported, or when you pressure it, when you try to increase reporting requirements around it, you either dramatically de-incentivize and possibly unfairly or unjustly, imprudently decrease the use of this technique, or you just incentivize it more to be done behind closed doors. But I feel like we're seeing a lot more of the former go on in Oregon, which is a state that went very, very aggressive at a state level in reducing exclusionary discipline, especially for students with disabilities, and also went very aggressive in trying to limit restraint and seclusion. There was a poll by the Oregon Education Association that came out earlier this year showing that 56% of teachers and parents said that their students have experienced at least one room clear during the course of a year. And a room clear was something that I, as an education policy expert with a particular emphasis on discipline safety, I hadn't heard of. Nobody that I speak to in my little DC education policy bubble had heard of it. But what a room clear is when there's a student who is throwing a bad tantrum, if you can't put a hand on him, if you can't put a hand on his shoulder and say, hey, Johnny, what's going on? Like, do you really want to do this? Or if it continues, if you can't, put a firmer hand on that shoulder and say, maybe we should go out of the room, because you can't take a kid out of the room without reporting it. Or if he starts to act out towards other students, you can't put two hands on his arms to make sure that he's not going to start swinging them wildly. The thing that's done now is to simply evacuate the entire room, which is insanity if you think about it. If you think about the process of there's a kid throwing a tantrum in a classroom, the teacher tells all the students to stand up, file out while this student is doing it, with a full expectation they're all going to file back in next to that student later. It's an extremely troubling phenomenon that's becoming increasingly normalized because of this policy drive that's predicated on a distrust of teacher. Oh, we can't let a teacher put a hand on a student unless it's entirely necessary. And we know what's entirely necessary, and we can do that in law. But it's something that I think I fear is dramatically increasing disruption. And it's not good for the student who is throwing that tantrum to be sent the message that if you act in this way, the entire world will conform around you and let you do as you please. So it's a troubling train that's, I think, picking up a lot of steam, both at the state level and also at the federal level. The Secretary of Education issued not quite a Dear Colleague letter, but announced an initiative involving investigations into school districts about their use of it, recommending tools for appropriate practices, kind of prejudicing the idea that restraint and seclusion is probably almost always inappropriate. And so in the same way that we saw a lot of the discipline suspension stuff, school districts react to it by simply not doing it or hiding it, or doing abeyance agreements to do it without doing it. I feel like we're going to be seeing a lot of it because there is no formal data collection process for room clears that didn't really exist until a couple of years ago. And so restraint and seclusion could be plummeting, room clears could be skyrocketing, but we're not going to really see that anywhere. And if you question the wisdom of lowering restraint and seclusion, you're going to be kind of put in a policy argumentative position of like, oh, do you endorse putting a kid in handcuffs for speaking out against a teacher? No, but probably most of the time, almost always, obviously some exceptions, if there's a teacher who feels the need to put a hand on a student, it's probably the right decision.
A must-read for parents, teachers, and taxpayers. Dr. David Perrodin has written the most honest book about the $3 billion school safety industrial complex. Attorney James Sibley proclaims, a brave demonstration of speaking truth to power. School of Errors rips the lid off the billion-dollar school safety industry. Using real-world examples of successful responses in desperate situations, David contrasts the expensive window dressings pitched to panicked parents with the inexpensive and effective approaches proven to actually work. Read this book before you let your school waste another precious dollar on meaningless safety theater. Buy the international bestseller School of Errors, Rethinking School Safety in America, now at Barnes & Noble or Amazon.
I've had congruent experiences with seclusion and restraint. And a few other components of that. Districts, for example, in Wisconsin, have teams that go through a training, and then they receive a card, and then they can go. There are steps of verbal de-escalation, and then also physical restraint, physical escort. And of course, there's conditions. You need to use this if the student you deem is at imminent harm to self or harm to others. So if the student is in the hallway throwing things and the bell is about to ring, you need to block off the hallways on both sides and reroute students all the way around the building or whatever you have to do, because that wouldn't be an acceptable condition. So teachers are saying, we don't want to be on this team anymore. This team that the state said, you can get trained because we can be liable. And also our judgment is being questioned. We can go through the training, we go through it, we make this determination, but we'll always be questioned. And the whole aspect in work I've done, legal expert witness work, is looking at the standard of care that was applied to the situation. So it's always laminated to that context, that situation. But now everybody is coming in after the fact and analyzing and saying, well, he should have done this, or it wasn't that bad, or whatever. And I'm also seeing parents call social services if a child has been restrained, and saying, my child now has bruises, so the next day at school, social services, or later that day, is at school interviewing members of the team. And that's so once you go through that, you don't want to be on the team anymore, right? Because I'm an educator. I need to look out for, my career, my best interests. I can't have, wherever these records, and I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do. And finally, it is saying, we'll call the SRO, we'll call the police and let them handle it. And then immediately you're introducing law enforcement to this child for something that would have been a classroom or principal disciplinary action to, even if it's noncompliance of the student not leaving the classroom or leaving the desk or whatever it is. And it's like, call the police, call the SRO. Yeah, we've done a lot more too.
Which is an interesting, so many of these things are done with this idea of trying to, fix the school to prison pipeline, and are sparked originally or in large part by viral videos of SROs, maybe throwing a kid across the room or shoving a kid against the wall, or a student saying that they believe that a police officer, treated them very differently based on race or status. And the policymakers at the federal level, and I've spoken to a few former Department of Education people under Obama, they fundamentally could not make the distinction between law enforcement response and school administrator response, and could not parcel out the notion that decreasing the discretion of teachers and principals would almost necessarily increase the role for school resource officers in handling routine infractions, right? On the one hand, they're saying we want to keep school resource officers far away from handling routine infractions, which I'm quite sympathetic to. On the other hand, they're telling teachers and administrators, take the lightest possible hand when it comes to routine or somewhat more than routine infractions, and you're going to be liable if you do something that's somewhat aggressive in response to it, which shifts it to law enforcement. There hasn't been a clear study on this, but you can find a lot of districts, LA is the most striking one, where suspensions dramatically decrease and arrests dramatically increase.
Yes.
If you do not have tools short of a guy with handcuffs to manage misbehavior, then misbehavior will be managed by a guy with handcuffs.
How about restorative practices? Every once in a while, somebody will say, well, it's worked in this setting or this setting, and they'll have some example, but that will come back saying, we need restorative practices in the schools. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I used to take the position that, I'm abstractly in favor of, or at least not opposed to restorative practice, but it just kind of has to be, done right and isn't really being done properly in many cases. I've come away from that position because I've come to doubt that restorative justice really ever exists in practice. The logic of it seems to go that, there are these techniques that we can use, and if we're properly trained and we have extra resources, they can go very well. If we're not properly trained, if we don't have extra resources, it's going to go very poorly. And we know that they're not properly trained, they don't have extra resources, and that these techniques really aren't employed. Nothing really happens. Right. So I don't even concede that restorative justice is a good idea in theory anymore, because the real theory of it isn't a particular way to sit students around in a circle and get to the root cause of it. What happens is nothing, or what happens is a student getting a lollipop after assaulting a teacher and saying, I'm sorry. So I don't believe that restorative justice is possible. I don't believe that restorative justice works because I don't believe that it happens. Maybe sometimes when teachers are really well trained and there are those extra supports given, it can work. People certainly tell stories of it working, but that's not what happens, and that's not what will happen. And unfortunately, even the argument that it can work if well implemented, I think has been, a lot of doubt has been cast on that by this Rand Institute study of Pittsburgh, which was the first randomized control trial of restorative justice. They had extra training, they had extra support. The teachers thought it worked. The teachers said, this is making me a better classroom leader, our school is safer, but the students disagreed. The students said, my teacher can't handle the classroom as well anymore. Classroom dynamics are getting worse, and test scores decreased in middle schools and decreased especially for African American students. So the argument that restorative justice, if implemented with fidelity, is an effective replacement for discipline is, by the best study that we have, not true, or not real. And that's in a way the best case, because it's very rarely, if ever, implemented with that support. Usually it's just something that principals say in order to explain how they manage to make discipline go down, when all that they're really doing is not meting out consequences.
The National Positive Behavioral Intervention and Support Center, the National PBIS Center.
Yeah.
So I started as an administrator in 2002, PBIS on a national scene, maybe 2007, 2008. I remember hearing about it at conferences and then starting to implement it. The concept behind PBIS, somewhat similar to restorative practices, but basically saying, if we are very overt in educating students about the school rules, for example, we make a 3-minute video, here's how we walk down to lunch, and here's how we stand in the lunch line, and here's what we do at recess, and we give tokens. So anytime, hey, I liked the greeting that you gave to the other students that came into the class. So here's a paw that you can redeem 10 of these for whatever it is, a pencil. But so it's this kind of token economy type setup. But PBIS has it's been around for decades. Conferences. I mean, people. This is their entire job. I'm a PBIS coach for this building. I question that. I want to know your findings about PBIS. I don't see that also as a model that is. I think there's tacitly we're instructing things which tacitly kids know what to do, but now it has to look good, and I have serious questions about the effectiveness of PBIS.
Yeah, well, I think in some ways I have a hard time just distinguishing between PBIS and restorative justice because in practice it all blends together.
Right.
A lot of people think that in the same way that restorative justice can be a substitute, PBIS can be a substitute. They usually point to one randomized control trial showing that PBIS led to a better school climate for elementary school students, but notably did not decrease suspensions. So the argument that it is an effective replacement for suspensions really isn't supported by anything in the literature, nor is the argument that it would really work outside of an elementary school setting that supported. Which, as an aside, I think there's also been a really basic inability to draw a distinction in people's minds between elementary students and middle and high school students. I mean, the idea that some things might work well for elementary students and might not work well for middle and high school students seems to be something that a lot of education policymakers can't grasp.
Right.
Like, oh, why would restorative justice did well in elementary schools but not well in middle and high schools? I guess it wasn't implemented effectively in middle and high schools. Maybe, or maybe it works for first and second graders in a way that it doesn't work for high schoolers. I mean, on taking my research hat off and just putting a human hat on, I'm somewhat kind of creeped out by the token economy, prize-oriented, explicit behavior gamification of PBIS. I just find it kind of creepy. And I wouldn't want my kid to be socialized in a setting where everything is that explicit. I would want the norms to be more implicit and understood between students without having to resort to this external thing. That being said, probably is the kind of thing that a first, second, third grader could easily buy into, but when you look at teacher message boards, when you talk to teachers,
right,
your middle school students, your high school students thinks this stuff's absurd.
Absolutely.
They just think it's silly. And you know, I'm prepared to believe it can be good at the elementary level. But both the teachers I talk to, the dearth of any research to suggest that it's a good thing, and kind of just knowledge of the way that, you know, the difference between young kids and adolescents are, I think it's not something that we know works or that we should expect to work, and certainly not that we should expect to be a replacement for consistent rules and consequences.
Do you see a decrease in the emphasis on PBIS because, you know, several states can go to their education department homepage and it's right there. Here's our PBIS department. It seems like it's gaining momentum.
It's absolutely. I mean, there was a survey that was done of elementary school principals. It was featured on Education Week, maybe like 6 months ago. 100% of elementary school principals said, my school uses PBIS.
Yes, of course, yes.
And also these elementary school principals say, and teachers say, and special ed administrators say, that misbehavior is increasing substantially. And then the conclusion that is drawn from that is, oh, well, we need more PBIS.
Right. Yeah, a tier 4 and a tier 4A. And, yes.
And it's, or just better training and better implementation. I mean, you can't conclude from that survey that PBIS is causing it, but if everybody is now doing this new thing and everybody is also saying that things are getting worse, it doesn't follow that more of this new thing is obviously going to make things better. I think it's, you know, you can't argue that it's clearly causally, I mean, I would argue that, but it's hard to do from data. But it defies logic to say that, you know, this thing that has taken schools by storm, that has certainly coincided with higher levels of reporting of problem behavior, is evidence that it would work if we go even harder at it.
So we know PBIS has fundamental issues for efficacy, hasn't been proven. Restorative practices, maybe some instances, but again, we don't have efficacy between a lit review, meta-analysis of research to indicate. So what what about students with disabilities? Because the number of students with disabilities in the United States, what are we looking about? 15%. We have 55 million students. So, but in some schools, we can have, 25% of the students are identified with a disability. Oftentimes emotional behavioral disability, something behavior related. But what's happening with students with disabilities and discipline? What's happening specific in that Venn diagram where those two circles overlap?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of concern amongst activist groups, Obama-era federal bureaucrats, that students with disabilities are disproportionately disciplined. Because if you look at the aggregate numbers, they receive discipline more frequently than students without disabilities. And the assumption goes very quickly to, oh, well, this must be a product of discrimination against students with disabilities. This has been, to my mind, pretty conclusively disproven by Paul Morgan's studies. He's a Penn State professor. He uses national survey data to try to take into account more factors that would influence student behavior, and finds that when you do, actually the entire disparity or apparent disproportionality of students with disabilities and discipline vanishes. It is simply not the case, according to the best data available, that students with disabilities are being discriminated against when it comes to discipline. If anything, they're probably being discriminated against in the opposite direction. There was a recent poll by the Fordham Institute found that 66% of teachers think that a student with a disability will be treated more leniently than a general education peer, even if their behavior had nothing to do with their disability. Only 4% of teachers think that a student with a disability is going to be treated more harshly than a general education peer. And that is more believable, because when it comes to students with disabilities, there is this added paperwork layer involved. There's this added disincentive involved. I mean, if you know that, at your second suspension, you're going to need to go to response to intervention at a 6-week monitoring and training program, right, you're not going to do it. Your principal is not going to want it.
And Max, just reconvening the IP. I mean, so now we have to take 10 schedules, and we have to have this meet right.
You're just not going to. You're not going to do it. It makes more sense to just let it slide, or to do it off record. Just send the kid home without putting into the system at all. And again, this is a place where a really wrong understanding of macro data by bureaucrats who look at a spreadsheet without any idea what these numbers mean, assume that these numbers mean that they're smart and other people are biased. This impulse filters down to the point to produce the exact opposite of discrimination. People making decisions not based on students and actions, but based on fear of paperwork. So I think students with disabilities it is, with them especially, it's the teachers that get in trouble if discipline is meted out.
Thank you for tuning in to the Safety Doc Podcast with the nation's leading safety expert, Dr. David Perrodin, author, radio show host, university instructor, researcher, expert witness, and consultant. Powerful testimonials. Dr. Perrodin has a strong reputation as the go-to safety consultant, and he was still able to exceed our expectations. When we went looking for an expert in the field of crisis preparedness and prevention, David was the single person we pursued. Not easy stepping into the touchier subjects of life, but Dr. David pulls it off. Take a listen. Now, back to Dr. David Perrodin and the Safety Doc Podcast.
Another aspect of with students with disabilities is I think it's less common to have IEP goals that address behavior. I used to see more of that in the past, and even social stories, and it's kind of maybe through the entire social justice, social equity that behaviors is also exiting. And you said student going home. Well, technically a student just can't go home. You'd have to put something in the log for the student. So in the afternoon, was it half a day of suspension? And that's where you can write into the IEP. And it's not always either ethical or accurate to do this, but the IEP might say the case manager principal can deem that the student needs a self-reflective time. And basically they're just sitting down with the parents saying, that means we're going to call you and they're going to go home. And you look at the attendance and it's like, oh, they missed one day this quarter. But, they were sent home, which isn't recorded anywhere, and they're not receiving academic instruction, not receiving behavior instruction, nothing that is improving or helping that student to improve behavior, and then also make that student safer when that student is interacting with other students at the time that they're in school or even out in the community. Tell me about why Meadow died. Andrew Pollack, Parkland was heart-wrenching. Yeah, for me as a school safety expert, I've known parents who have had their children murdered in school shooting. Some of them are very close friends of mine. First, tell me about how you had the connection with Andrew.
Yeah. So I first heard of the shooting on the news like everybody else, and it struck me about a week after that there were all these students coming forward to the media saying, we knew that this kid was going to do this. He brought bullets to school. He brought knives to school. He threatened to kill us. He threatened to rape us. He threatened to shoot up the school. We all knew that it was him while it was happening. And we saw something and we said something, and they never did anything. And, as you and your listeners can tell, like the issue of administrators not taking action for obvious and at times dangerous misbehavior is something that I've been trying to dig into. So when I saw this, I couldn't help but wonder, I wonder if there was a reason why they didn't do anything. This kid is alleged to have committed, and they did commit many crimes in school for which he was never arrested. Might this have had something to do with the school district being at the national cutting edge of trying to fight the so-called school-to-prison pipeline by aggressively lowering arrests? So I wrote an article to this effect, which raised the question, but it didn't answer the question, and nobody else seemed that willing to answer the question. It seemed as though it divided pretty quickly into partisan lines, with a lot of mainstream media, Democrat politicians saying it's the guns, it's the guns. A lot of conservative media kind of took the argument I made, the question I raised, and assumed it was an answer and just ran with that as an answer. But I wanted to kind of know what went wrong and why. And a couple of months after I wrote that, nobody had yet answered that. I found a way to get down to Parkland. I found kind of an inn with a Broward student who had some friends at Stoneman Douglas, knew some teachers at Stoneman Douglas, and I traveled down kind of under his auspices to talk to some folks. And while I was there, Andrew heard that there was somebody from DC who was an education expert there to look into the school. And he got my number and he texted me and asked me to come over to his house and explain to him what I was doing, because he was trying to contact every single person who he thought could help find him answers, could help, as he always says, expose what went wrong and hold people accountable. And so I explained to him, this is the issue I've been looking into. Here's why I think it might have had something to do with this. I want to talk to people to figure out what the full story is here. And a couple days later, he texts me and says, thanks so much, Max. You're going to be a tremendous asset helping me find justice for my daughter's murder. And I was like, oh, okay. I had only planned on getting a couple sources to write an article, and now I have to go back and at least take one more trip at it.
Right.
And on my second trip, I found out enough about what had happened in the shooter's life, what had happened with him in the school, that I realized, this isn't just a book. This isn't just an article. It has to be a book. And I told him that, and he said, well, we should do it together because I want every answer. Let's team up. I can help you. You can't find all these people without me, and I can't write a whole book without you. So let's expose everything. And that's kind of how the partnership started.
Tell me about your access to information. What were some of the barriers that were put up as far as approaching, the district's handbook, for example, looking for the handbook, interviewing students, interviewing staff, the data that you didn't find. Tell me about that.
Yeah, the the first and most glaring thing, right, is FERPA and the way that school districts use FERPA as a shield, right? I mean, teachers were told very quickly, we are monitoring every login and all actions taken within our student data service. So if we find that you looked at the shooter's record and then info about the shooter makes its way to the press, yeah, you're going to be in trouble.
Right.
So the district locked down all information from his records, wouldn't give them to the press, wouldn't, strongly discourage teachers from finding them. So his full education record was something that had been and was for a long time. Eventually we got it, I'll explain how in a second, is somewhat of a holy grail to me. Like, that's where the story is, but that's something that legally we're not going to find. The district has a very vested interest in making sure that people don't find it. And, administrators at Stoneman Douglas and other administrators who come in contact with him weren't going to talk to me for two reasons. One is I was looking into actions that they took right. That might have reflected badly on them. But even if they wanted to, if they were to talk to me, their jobs would be on the line. They are legally prohibited from divulging student information to a reporter or to a journalist. And that's a law that you should have. If I come around snooping for some random 16-year-old kid for gossip, that it's good the law is there to not right. let me do that. But that law, unfortunately, does not cease to apply when a kid shoots up a school. So I had to talk to just as many students as I could find and as many teachers that I could find and re-interview a lot of them after having interviewed them once, twice, three times based on other things that other people had told me, and try to construct a full account of what happened with him while also trying to get a full kind of documentary understanding of the district and its policies. I mean, one kind of funny aside, there was a policy document that showed that the school district had gone so far in trying to reintegrate convicted felons into the school in an effort to fight the school to prison pipeline by building a pipeline from prison to school. They literally said that kids who are convicted of rape, murder, attempted murder, firearms-related offenses, after 180 days in an alternative setting could be put back into traditional school. And the district denied that this was their policy and took the document off the website. Fortunately, not before we got it.
Right.
So, we had to fight tooth and nail for all the documents we had, all the data we had. Eventually, once I kind of found most of the shooter's story and Andy had internalized a lot of it, I said to him, we're basically acting as your daughter's murderer's defense attorney in the court
yes.
of public opinion.
Yes.
Because our argument is that it's everybody else's fault too. Like, if you're comfortable with that, that's what his defense attorney is doing. Maybe they'll give us the records that we've been looking for. And he approached the defense attorney and said, give me all of his records, and when I take the stand at the trial, I'll blast the school district for all of its failures. And so, after months of kind of scraping for all information, we finally got the full record, which was quite explicit and quite horrific in a lot of ways.
So what's changed since Parkland? I guess what's gotten better, what hasn't changed, what's gotten worse for student safety?
In Broward or nationwide?
Let's do Broward and then let's do nationwide second.
Yeah, in Broward, absolutely nothing has changed. The school district was, they stonewalled, they covered up, they attacked their critics, they even attacked the families of the victims very aggressively in the public forum for calling for accountability in ways that are despicable and shameful, and insist that they did nothing wrong and that all their policies worked. It got to the point where basically, because these policies are framed as issues of racial justice and racial equity, and because the families of the victims were questioning these policies, the families of the victims were slandered as racists by top school district administrators. And they've been very, very insistent that nothing changed. The state investigative committee recommended that the Promise program, this particular diversionary program that gives students 3 free misdemeanors a year before they're even allowed to talk to law enforcement, and resets the misdemeanor count every single year.
Right.
The state commission has said like this should stop, and the legislature is making some motions that it might make it illegal. But as soon as the legislature made a law saying that diversionary programs like Promise need to report their data to the states, then Broward said, "Oh well, Promise isn't a diversionary program; it's an alternate suspension program."
Absolutely.
And a lot of the families ran. A couple of family members ran for school board to try to change things. One friend of a deceased teacher ran kind of as a slate, and all the families of the victims were behind them, endorsed the idea that there should be new candidates, new blood, new leadership. And 2 of them lost, 1 of them got on, and nothing has changed there. Like no lessons have been learned, and it's been quite sad. It's kind of questioned my faith in local democracy. And nationwide, there's maybe some more bright lights. I mean, I think that one thing that happened in the wake of it was the Trump administration issued a federal school safety commission that did about 10 months worth of investigating and issued a 100-page report on school safety, most of which was just a lot of best practices, the stuff that you as a security escort. I hope a lot of it that you would agree with and say like, yeah, I'm glad that this document exists. I'm glad that it's getting out there.
Right.
And to the extent that it is, it's providing useful information to school leaders. I think that it's been somewhat unfortunate that a lot of the reaction to Parkland was not informed by the full story of Parkland, which is to me far less of a hardware question than a software question, right?
Yes.
If you take care of your students, if the adults make responsible decisions around students, then something like this doesn't happen. But because the debate immediately went to either gun control or pro-school hardening, we've seen a lot of schools take a lot of steps, throw a lot of money at a lot of ideas that are kind of shadow theater, that give the appearance of a safe exterior, but don't actually address safety issues that, whether or not those things could possibly deter or prevent or mitigate the instance of a school shooter, they certainly have nothing to do with how safe a school is for anything short of a school shooting. And I think that, because the truth was so long in coming out, and because a lot of the conversation already moved on past that, I don't think the proper lessons were learned.
So the Youth Code of Silence, kids, 75% of the time when there's a school shooting, somebody else knew or multiple people knew. And we've known this National Threat Assessment Center, FBI, going back from Columbine through Parkland. But when you have a culture where if you report something, nothing is done. The student is maybe short term out, student is back. Students aren't going to continue to report. I mean, we know that through Youth Code of Silence research that once students feel nothing will be done, they will shut down reporting.
Yeah, and properly so. I mean,
right. So we have 75% of the time. And Bethel, Alaska, 1997, the shooting in Bethel, Alaska, 24 students appeared on a mezzanine overlooking the cafeteria area. 1 had a camera, and 2 had trained the shooter on the use of the shotgun, and they just watched it unfold. Nobody came forward with that information. So why Meadow died in the failed policies and the failed practices of school. In my work in School Affairs, pointed out $3 billion a year spent on school safety. Over 80% of that fortifications, max, fences, bollards, surveillance cameras, things like that. We're not spending on threat assessment, threat instruction, threat assessment, researching the Youth Code of Silence. Dollars aren't going into that. making sure that we have a range of placements, a range of services for students, placement options, which might be off campus, or that, we're not going there with the dollars. It is complete safety theater right now. And it's appalling. I sent you an article from the 74 million org, October 21st. Mark Reber wrote about the National School Superintendents Organization, representing all 50 states. All 50 states have their own superintendent. State organization goes into the feds. This federal organization, or this organization at a national level. For $18,000, you can become a school solutions partner with the organization. So basically they say, we endorse your product or service or whatever it is. Yeah. And they have 18 that they do, and it's growing. And that's just, so we have these conflicted interests also that are at play, and they are pushed forward when something of a sentinel nature. When Parkland happens, then fortification takes 3 steps forward. We have funding for fortification, and that's where people want to go right away. No one wants to get at root causes. No one wants to get lasting change. They want to go with the new bollards, the next version of the algorithm that they can put on their computer system and say, we're going to identify kids searching certain terms and stuff like that. And we just know that hasn't proven to be effective.
Yeah, I was contacted maybe 6 months after the shooting, after I was like a few months into looking into it, by a Washington Post reporter who was writing an article on, the school security industry, and the crux of an article was Broward was either contracting or thinking about contracting with an AI company that would log into the video system and use AI to understand, is there an intruder or are students acting suspicious? And like this big thing that maybe it could work. I color me profoundly skeptical of it. Certainly sounds very expensive and sounds like it's almost certainly not going to. I just said to him, and I would say anybody else, how about instead of trying to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to create an artificial intelligence to monitor student behavior, you just don't pervert the judgment of adults. How about you just let them make the decisions that they think are proper? Could we do that instead? Andy, my co-author, he believes in school hardening to a point, right? I mean, he believes in metal detectors and single point of entry and armed guard under the pretty basic logic that there's not going to be a weapon entering a building if there's only one point you can get through. If there's a metal detector there and an armed guard, I have somewhat mixed feelings about it. I just thought you'd share one funny anecdote with you. Is that at one point he and a couple other Parkland parents were on a call with a school security thing that was offering special coding that would make class bulletproof. And he was just like, well, how about you just don't let the gun get into the school?
Right.
And the guy had no answer to that.
Right.
Or if you're going to build all these gates, how about you lock them? The Parkland shooter walked through an unlocked gate. It was supposed to be single point of entry. It just wasn't. It was door to the school was unlocked. Door to the campus was unlocked. The school had a lot of cameras. Nobody was in the station at first. The cameras weren't connected to local law enforcement, which ended up probably costing lives. So there's a lot of, in my opinion, there's a lot of low-hanging physical fruit that could be done. But unfortunately, these things become a marketing opportunity for a lot of nonsense, but also at the huge opportunity cost of looking into the fundamental question of are students, do they feel safe in school? Are they being treated well? Are adults making the right decisions around them? And this is something that, even the awareness that there were these sorts of problems that played a role in the Parkland shooting only emerged because of this book published a year and a half later. And even then, because of the partisan nature of our media, as Andy has said, if you're a parent, the only way you're going to know what really happened in Parkland, and the way you're going to know the questions you need to ask your students and your teachers is if you watch Fox News.
Sure.
I mean, beyond that, like the message just doesn't get through, either through the media or through that, because there are interests in the physical hardware side of things, and all of the interests in the software side of things, the human side of things, is, to my mind, on the wrong side of this.
Right.
They're the folks who are pushing PBIS, pushing restorative justice, pushing other interventions that will try to scientifically manage teacher behavior. And there isn't really a product to push on the opposite side of that. The only product is have consistent rules, consequences, and trust teachers with the discretion to know what's right for their students. There's not much money to be made in that, unfortunately.
I'll work with districts about how to develop student focus groups, because everybody does surveys, and surveys become long and tedious, and we don't know the level of understanding students have with surveys. So why don't we take 4, 6, 8 students and for an hour have a discussion of if someone were to start here next week, what would they need to know about our school for safety? And then work into some other questions about culture. Have some constructs. I teach people how to do that. That is so much more informative than a survey. And also addressing the youth code of silence. And, and Max, you talked about algorithms, and I warned about this when I presented on PBS in July. I said algorithms will quickly identify every student who is goth as being on a watch list. It will. Stephen King in 2021 will be on a watch list, and so it's happening right now with districts close to where I live, who have 24-hour monitoring of Chromebooks that go home with students, and suddenly all of this false triggering is happening. But then it also creates where the students are like, I'm not going to use this. It's a private, I'm being scrutinized. I'm going to reinforce the youth code of silence. The adults aren't trusting me. And we also have reporting systems which ask a student, how do you report a threat? And they'll say, I don't know. Do I go to an adult, or I have my phone and we have an app? And literally it was 23 different screens you had to go through before it was finally, do you actually want to make this report? And I looked at it and I said, there are 3 steps on here where basically they don't want you to make this report. Because then they're going to have to investigate it, and it's a document and it's a piece of data that they don't want to exist. So it's absolutely crazy the response of putting systems in that just complicate things, erode tacit knowledge, professional discretion. Everything is second guessed. So I'll say, from my perspective, I think we have more students coming forward and communicating to an adult if they're aware of a student who could be at risk of threat of harm to self or others. Now, oddly, I don't see that being celebrated. For example, Sandy Hook Promise had the 1 minute, I guess, I don't know, infomercial, commercial, right, public service. And, the first 30 seconds, and then suddenly a kid with a skateboard. This comes in handy when I have to smash out the window. And I contacted Sandy Hook Promise after. I said, you lost an opportunity, because kids are starting to come forward. And we need to, at least, if we have this going for us, we need to put as much wind behind it as we can. Yeah,
we need to celebrate those people.
Absolutely.
I mean, and this is,
absolutely.
Andy and I are still somewhat ongoing partners in this. And he has a good social media platform. I just write op-eds, so it's not like I can write every time it happens. But every time we ever see a story of like somebody seeing something, saying something, and something get averted, we try our best to congratulate the person who said something as a hero. There were students who would have been heroes in the Parkland situation if their reports had been listened to.
Right. And that was that's extremely frustrating to you, to analyze Parkland and to say these parts of the system worked. Kids made the reports, people identified, and then the reaction, the response wasn't appropriate to the report. And once we lose that integrity in the safety system, it's really hard to build anything forward from that, because people say it didn't work at Parkland. Why would it work here, or why would it work there? And it's an absolutely devastating cascade effect of people not matching what would be a minimum standard of care, a basic response, a minimal response, just not matching it back. So it's, well, Max, I am extremely appreciative for your work. You produce incredible amount of content, going through, the different articles you're doing, the research component. You're very in tune with what's happening in student safety and student policy. Thank you so much for your work with Why Meadow Died. I believe that book absolutely needed to be written. We didn't have a policy analysis and I guess also a social policy analysis until Why Meadow Died.
Yeah.
And it's, people absolutely need to know that, because they have no idea that this is what the structure, this arching structure that oversees schools, that holds accountability. Most people, nobody knows, school safety, 7 states, they completely default it down to the local level. Pennsylvania, Hawaii, Indiana. So you go to the state statute and it says, right down. Right. So then, they put together a safety plan, or they have data. Who looks at it? Nobody is even looking at the data. A lot of times it's one page that gets submitted that, we did our drills. We have a handbook section that includes reporting threats. Everything's checked off and turned in. A lot of times only those don't get submitted. So you're holding people, I think, accountable. And the other part is you're bringing awareness. You're educating people to, I would say, the red pill side of safety that needs to happen. I have incredible respect for you, Max, for the work that you've done. And thank you so much for providing this interview to me and to my audience.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
This has been the Safety Doc Podcast with author, radio show host, and leading safety expert, Dr. David Perrotin. Remember to check back each week for the latest, best, and most bizarre practices in safety preparation and crisis response. You can find Dr. Perrotin on Twitter @SafetyPhD. And remember, the truth will keep you safe.